Welcome back to Nocturne Historia. In the late 11th century, a storm was brewing across Europe and the Middle East. Two worlds, Christian and Islamic, had long shared the Mediterranean, often uneasily, but a seismic shift was coming. A series of wars, now known as the Crusades, would explode from this ancient crossroads, reshaping borders, faith, and the course of history itself. At the heart of it all was the Byzantine Empire. Once the proud eastern half of the Roman world, it now faced a serious threat, the relentless advance of Turkish forces into its Anatolian heartland. Emperor Alexios Komnenos, desperate and outnumbered, reached across the cultural divide and appealed to Western Europe for help. A fateful decision. One that would spark centuries of war. Meanwhile, Europe itself was transforming. Feudalism had produced a generation of knights without land, but not without ambition. The population was growing fast, straining farmlands and resources. And in the hearts of many Christians, a powerful spiritual yearning burned bright. Pilgrimages to holy sites, especially Jerusalem, were acts of deep devotion. But Jerusalem was under Muslim control and had been since the 7th century. Though Christians had long been allowed to visit, new political instability threatened this delicate balance. Within Christendom, divisions ran deep. In 1054, the Great Schism split the Church into Roman Catholicism in the West and Eastern Orthodoxy in the East. Mistrust, theological disputes, and mutual suspicion lingered. Yet despite these tensions, a shared concern now loomed large: the Holy Land. In the Muslim world, unity had fractured. The great Abbasid Caliphate had splintered. The Seljuk Turks rose in the east, the Fatimids controlled Egypt, and various emirs competed for dominance in between. Into this volatile mix stepped Pope Urban II. In November 1095, at the Council of Clermont, he issued a thunderous call to arms. Speaking before a crowd of nobles and clergy, he painted a harrowing picture: Christians suffering under Muslim rule, sacred sites defiled, and the cradle of Christendom in peril. His words struck a nerve. Across Europe, the message spread like wildfire. People from all walks of life, knights, peasants, nobles, began to prepare. For some, it was a holy mission, a path to eternal salvation. For others, it was a chance to claim land, gold, or glory. What began as a plea for help became a continent-wide movement. Over the next 2 centuries, there would be 9 major crusades and countless smaller campaigns. Their goals, leaders, and outcomes varied wildly, but one thing remained constant: the impact. The Crusades forever altered the dynamics between East and West, faith and politics, war and belief. And it all began with one speech, one moment, at Clermont, where the fate of 3 civilizations pivoted on a pope's plea and a dream of Jerusalem restored. At the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II spoke with fire and urgency. He declared, "An outside race has invaded the lands of Christians and has depopulated them by the sword, pillage, and fire." But more than just a military warning, it was a spiritual summons. Urban offered full remission of sins to anyone who took up the cross. In an age when salvation was the ultimate goal, that promise carried immense power. The crowd was electrified. Cries of Deus vult, God wills it, echoed through the assembly, and that phrase would become the heartbeat of the crusading cause. What followed was a 2-pronged movement, driven by the same religious fervor, but wildly different in preparation. The first phase came to be known as the People's Crusade. Led by Peter the Hermit, a charismatic French monk, thousands of peasants, townspeople, and minor knights set off in the spring of 1096, months before any official army. But what they had in faith, they lacked in military discipline, resources, and leadership. As they marched across Europe, their presence turned violent. In the Rhineland, Jewish communities were brutally attacked, as some crusaders sought enemies of Christ not in the Holy Land, but at home. When they reached Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexios I, wary of their erratic behavior and overwhelming numbers, quickly ferried them across the Bosporus to Anatolia. There, in October 1096, Turkish forces crushed the undisciplined crusaders near Nicaea, bringing the People's Crusade to a tragic end. But the main expedition, the Prince's Crusade, was only just beginning. Unlike the earlier mob, this army was composed of seasoned warriors and led by high-ranking nobles from across Europe. In late summer and early autumn of 1096, four major contingents departed their homelands. From Lorraine came Godfrey of Bouillon, a devout and capable commander who sold or mortgaged much of his land to fund his journey. He was joined by his brothers Baldwin and Eustace. From southern Italy, Bohemond of Taranto, a cunning Norman knight with battlefield experience and personal ambition, led a smaller but highly trained force. From southern France came Count Raymond of Toulouse, an elder statesman by medieval standards at 55, but unwavering in his vow to reach Jerusalem. Northern France contributed another powerful group led by Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, and Stephen of Blois. Though influential, they lacked the singular leadership that marked the other contingents. By early 1097, the various armies converged at Constantinople. There they met Emperor Alexios once again. Distrustful after his prior dealings with Western soldiers, the emperor insisted on oaths of fealty and promises to return any recovered Byzantine land. The Crusader leaders agreed, though how sincerely is debatable. With Byzantine guides and supplies in place, the combined Crusader force crossed into Anatolia. Their first major victory came at Nicaea in June 1097, captured after a joint siege with Byzantine forces. A month later at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders beat back a fierce Turkish counterattack, securing their route deeper into the interior. But the road eastward was brutal. The army endured searing heat, scarce water, and constant harassment by Turkish raiders. Still, their determination never faltered. By October 1097, they stood before the towering walls of Antioch, a city of immense strategic and symbolic importance. The siege of Antioch was about to begin, and with it, the Crusaders would face one of the greatest tests of the entire campaign. The siege of Antioch pushed the Crusaders to their breaking point. For 8 long months, they endured starvation, disease, and desertion. Winter brought not only bitter cold, but the departure of key leaders like Stephen of Blois, who abandoned the cause in despair. Yet, amidst the misery, fate, or perhaps cunning, shifted the course of events. Bohemond, ever the strategist, reached out to an Armenian guard named Firuz, who agreed to betray the city. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Crusaders scaled the wall under Firuz's command, flung open the gates, and flooded into Antioch. The victory, however, was cruelly brief. Just 3 days later, the formidable Kerboga of Mosul arrived with a vast Muslim relief army, trapping the exhausted Crusaders within the city they had barely secured. Supplies ran low, morale withered, but then came a curious spark of hope. A humble peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received divine visions guiding him to the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side. Though leaders doubted his story, the discovery of an iron point beneath the cathedral floor electrified the troops. To many, it was nothing less than a miracle. On June 28th, driven by renewed faith, the Crusaders surged from the gates of Antioch and defied all military logic. Against Kerboga's superior forces, they achieved a stunning victory. It was hailed as a sign of God's favor. But glory invited conflict. Bohemond claimed Antioch for himself, disregarding earlier promises to return conquered lands to the Byzantine Empire. In doing so, he established the Principality of Antioch, the first of the Crusader states, and set a precedent that others would soon follow. With Antioch secured, the crusade pressed southward in January 1099. The army, now only a fraction of its former size, trudged along the Levantine coast. Many local Muslim rulers, wary of conflict, preferred negotiation. By June 7th, the weary Crusaders, around 12,000 strong, finally reached the sacred city of Jerusalem. Their journey had spanned nearly 3 years and thousands of perilous miles. But the final hurdle loomed large. Jerusalem's massive walls and seasoned Fatimid garrison offered no easy prize. The first assault on June 13th failed. Their siege engines were inadequate. The Crusaders regrouped, harvesting timber and constructing wooden towers and catapults. Meanwhile, the heat was merciless, and water was scarce. Local sources poisoned or blocked by defenders. Then on July 14th, the night before battle, the army held solemn processions, praying for victory. At dawn, the final assault began. Godfrey's forces breached the northern wall. Raymond's troops pushed through the southwest. What came next would stain the Crusades' legacy forever. Inflamed by years of hardship and religious zeal, The Crusaders unleashed a massacre within the city. Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians fell to their swords. Chroniclers speak of blood running through the streets, and while these descriptions may be dramatized, modern sources confirm the violence was widespread and indiscriminate. Amidst the slaughter, a new political order emerged. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was proclaimed, the Fourth Crusader state, joining Edessa, Antioch, and soon after Tripoli. A holy city seized, but at a terrible cost. After the dramatic conquest of Jerusalem in 1009, leadership of the new kingdom passed to Godfrey of Bouillon, but rather than calling himself king, he adopted the humbler title, Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. His death in 1100 brought his brother Baldwin III to power, who had no such reservations. Baldwin claimed the royal crown, cementing the kingdom's political structure and formalizing the Crusader state's authority. The First Crusade had achieved what no later expedition could quite replicate. It not only seized Jerusalem, but also carved out Latin Christian states across the Levant. That success, however, was less a miracle than a perfect storm of circumstances. It was driven by religious passion, by seasoned warriors, and by skilled, if often contentious, leaders. But most decisively, it was enabled by the deep divisions within the Muslim world. The Seljuk Turks and the Fatimid Egyptians were bitter rivals. Their inability to unite against the incoming threat allowed the Crusaders to punch through, largely unopposed. News of Jerusalem's fall stunned Europe. Pope Urban II, the man who launched the crusade, died before hearing of its success. But for many, the victory confirmed their belief that the mission had divine approval. Crusading, once a radical idea, was now viewed as both a spiritual calling and a military solution. Yet this fragile foothold in the Holy Land would not go unchallenged. As the decades passed, the balance of power began to shift. Muslim leaders, once fragmented, gradually found unity. That shift came to a head in 1144 when the easternmost Crusader state, the county of Edessa, fell. It was a devastating blow. The Turkish Atabeg, Imad ad-Din Zengi, captured the city in a single day after a brief siege. The Latin Christians who once ruled Edessa were slaughtered or enslaved. Europe reeled at the loss. The defeat wasn't just a military failure, it was a symbolic collapse of Christian strength in the East. In response, Pope Eugenius III issued a call to arms in 1145 through the papal bull Quantum Praedicatores. But unlike Urban's call 50 years earlier, this time the response was lukewarm. Europe had changed. Monarchs had consolidated their power and were less eager to send armies eastward. It seemed that the crusading spirit was fading, until one man rekindled it. Bernard of Clairvaux, abbot and one of the most influential religious voices of his day, stepped forward. His sermons electrified audiences across Europe. At Vézelay in 1146, Bernard stood beside King Louis VII of France and delivered a fiery plea. Nobles were so moved they tore their clothes to form makeshift crosses, the mark of the Crusader. Louis, young, devout, and seeking penance for his role in a horrific massacre at Vitry, embraced the cause. For him, the Second Crusade was both a holy mission and a personal redemption. Soon after, the movement gained even more weight. Bernard traveled to Frankfurt, where he persuaded Conrad III of Germany to join. Conrad became the first German king to take the cross. With both France and the Holy Roman Empire aligned, the Second Crusade now carried the might of Western Europe. This expedition would differ in another striking way. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, Louis's wife and one of the most powerful women of her time, would accompany him. Her presence made this crusade not just a religious or military affair, but a political and cultural event of epic scale. She was intelligent, politically savvy, and as fierce-willed as any noble of her time. Eleanena, more widely known as Eleanor of Aquitaine, joined the Second Crusade with a formidable army from her vast lands in southwestern France. Her arrival wasn't just symbolic. It revealed how deeply personal ambition, political strategy, and religious fervor intertwined in the crusading spirit. But this crusade was different. It didn't just focus on the Holy Land. In Spain, Christian kingdoms fought Muslim territories with support from crusaders in what became known as the Reconquista. At the same time, German nobles launched holy campaigns against pagan Slavs in the Baltic. These diverse fronts showed how crusading ideals had evolved. They were now a powerful tool for political expansion as much as religious cause. The main eastern expedition, however, stumbled from the outset. King Conrad III's German army marched first in May 1147, following the Danube to Constantinople. Poor discipline and pillaging strained relations with Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos. And despite receiving advice to follow a safer coastal route, Conrad led his troops across Anatolia's harsh central plateau, retracing the First Crusade's steps toward Dorylaeum. But times had changed. On October 25, 1147, Turkish forces ambushed and shattered his army. Survivors limped back to Nicaea, demoralized. King Louis VII of France arrived later that autumn. His forces, more disciplined, met the exhausted Germans and pressed on by the coastal path. But even this route proved perilous. Turkish raids, mountainous terrain, and dwindling supplies wore down morale. By the time they reached Antalya in early 1148, Louis abandoned the land route entirely, securing ships for himself and his nobles to sail for Antioch, leaving thousands of soldiers and pilgrims behind to perish or be enslaved. When the tattered remnants of the crusade reached Antioch, the situation only worsened. Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch and Alelinina's uncle, proposed attacking Aleppo or recapturing Edessa, targets aligned with the Crusade's original purpose. Alelinina supported her uncle's plan, and some sources even hinted at a too close relationship between the two. Outraged, King Louis abruptly left Antioch, forcing Alelinina to accompany him to Jerusalem. Their arrival led to a war council in Acre, with King Baldwin III, Conrad, and other leaders debating their next move. Logic pointed to Edessa, or striking Nur ad-Din, successor of Zengi. But instead they chose to attack Damascus, a city that had long been a peaceful buffer between the Crusaders and more hostile Muslim states. This decision wasn't rooted in the grand ideals of the Crusade. It was driven by Jerusalem's local politics, a fatal departure from broader goals that would haunt the campaign's fate. In July of 1148, the Crusaders launched what would become one of their most disastrous military blunders, the Siege of Damascus. At first, things looked promising. They occupied the fertile orchards to the west of the city, but then, inexplicably, they shifted their position to the arid, exposed eastern side. There they found little water, poor cover, and growing frustration. As whispers spread of Nur ad-Din's army approaching, tensions among the Crusader factions flared into paranoia. After only 4 days, they abandoned the siege in humiliation. The Second Crusade, once filled with hope and divine purpose, ended in failure. Emperor Conrad limped back to Germany. King Louis of France remained in Jerusalem until spring, doing little but visiting holy sites. When he finally returned home, the campaign had nothing to show for its vast expenditure of life and treasure. Europe reacted with dismay. Bernard of Clairvaux, the charismatic preacher who had promised that God would bless this holy endeavor, now found himself the target of public anger. He defended the outcome by comparing the Crusaders to biblical Israelites, tested by God through hardship. It was a convenient explanation and one that would echo again in later crusading failures. Blame the sin, not the strategy. But strategy had failed spectacularly. The attempt to attack Damascus not only failed militarily, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. Damascus, which had previously balanced its interests between Crusaders and Muslim neighbors, now turned fully to Nur ad-Din. The city became part of an emerging, unified Muslim resistance. For leaders like Nur ad-Din, the failed crusade confirmed the need for greater unity among Islamic powers. And it worked. Across the Muslim world, jihad began to take firmer root, not just as a personal spiritual duty, but as a collective military cause. Meanwhile, the Latin Christian world took a more cautious approach. Large-scale crusading efforts slowed, but the idea itself didn't die. Instead, the defense of the Crusader states shifted to a new kind of warrior. The military orders. The Templars and Hospitallers were born from this crisis, professional soldiers of faith who lived under monastic rule but fought with deadly skill. These orders became a backbone of Crusader defense in the decades to follow. Still, the Second Crusade had revealed a hard truth. The stunning victories of the First Crusade would not be repeated easily. The balance of power was shifting, and fast. While the Crusader states struggled with political infighting and dynastic squabbles, the Muslim world found a new champion. His name was Saladin. Born in 1137 to a Kurdish military family, Saladin rose through the ranks under Nur-ad-Din's command. When Nur-ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin acted swiftly. He seized Damascus. He secured Cairo. In just a few years, he united Egypt and Syria under his leadership. With cunning diplomacy, battlefield brilliance, and deep religious conviction, he forged a new Islamic empire, the Ayyubid dynasty. Saladin was not just a ruler, he became a symbol, a man who embodied the ideals of Islamic resistance to Crusader occupation. And soon he would lead the Muslim world into a new and even more decisive chapter of the Crusades. Saladin approached the conflict with the Latin Crusader states not with impulse, but with strategy. Unlike many of his predecessors, he first secured his internal base, fortifying the economy, consolidating his military, and neutralizing potential Muslim rivals. His reputation for justice and commitment to Islamic law won him admiration across the Islamic world, while his long-term vision positioned him for a decisive confrontation. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was unraveling from within. King Baldwin IV, although competent, was afflicted by leprosy, and as his illness worsened, succession disputes fractured the court. Two major factions emerged, one led by Raymond III of Tripoli, advocating a pragmatic peace with Muslim neighbors, and the other, far more aggressive, led by Reynald of Châtillon and Guy of Lusignan. Reynald, in particular, became a dangerous liability. Despite truces, he launched raids on Muslim caravans and even threatened Mecca and Medina during a provocative attack in 1183. These violations handed Saladin the legal and moral justification he needed to wage war. In 1186, after a sequence of royal deaths, Guy of Lusignan, married to Baldwin IV's sister Sibylla, claimed the throne. Raymond III refused to acknowledge Guy's kingship and initially maintained a separate truce with Saladin. But peace could not last. In 1187, Reynald once again violated the truce by attacking a large Muslim caravan. Saladin demanded restitution, but Guy failed to restrain Reynald. With the truce shattered and religious as well as political motivations aligned, Saladin mobilized a massive army, the largest seen in the region since the First Crusade. As pressure mounted, Guy and Raymond reconciled to form a united front. But unity was not enough. Against Raymond's cautious advice, Guy chose to leave the defensible stronghold of Tiberias and meet Saladin in open battle. The result was a catastrophe. On July 4, 1187, at the Horns of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee, the Crusader army was drawn into a trap. Saladin had blocked access to water and surrounded their forces on a dry plateau. Under blistering heat and dehydration, the Crusader ranks withered. One by one, their formations collapsed under Saladin's methodical assault. By the day's end, most of the kingdom's fighting strength lay dead or in captivity. Among the captured were King Guy, Reynald of Châtillon, and many prominent nobles. Saladin executed Reynald personally, holding him accountable for his treachery and raids on Muslim pilgrims. The rest were treated in accordance with the chivalric standards of the time, but Saladin showed no mercy to the military orders. Templars and Hospitallers were given the choice to convert or die. Most chose death. With the Crusader field army destroyed, Saladin launched a sweeping campaign across the kingdom. One fortress after another fell. Then came the crown jewel, Jerusalem. After a brief siege, the city surrendered on October 2, 1187. But here, Saladin once again defied expectations. Unlike the bloody conquest of 1099, when Crusaders had slaughtered Muslims and Jews alike, Saladin allowed for an orderly evacuation. Most Christians were permitted to ransom themselves and leave peacefully, taking portable belongings with them. It was a moment of extraordinary restraint, and it would shape Saladin's legacy in both the Islamic world and Western memory as that of a just and magnanimous conqueror. Saladin's capture of Jerusalem in 1187 shocked the Christian world, but his treatment of the city stood in sharp contrast to the brutality of the First Crusade. He allowed many inhabitants to leave peacefully, a magnanimity that elevated his standing across faith lines. Yet, by year's end, nearly all Crusader territory had fallen, save for a few coastal enclaves like Tyre, heroically defended by Conrad of Montferrat. The once proud kingdom of Jerusalem had all but vanished. In Europe, panic turned to purpose. Pope Gregory VIII issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, calling on Christendom to reclaim the Holy City. This time the response was thunderous. For the first time since the First Crusade, Three of Europe's most powerful monarchs took the cross. Frederick Barbarossa, the aging but revered Holy Roman Emperor, Philip II of France, shrewd and calculating, and Richard I of England, bold and charismatic, soon known as Richard the Lionheart. This coalition earned the campaign the name the King's Crusade. Among them, Frederick was the elder statesman. Nearing 70, he had already fought in the Second Crusade and now led the largest force, some estimate as many as 100,000 men, including 20,000 knights. In May 1189, he set out by land, marching through Hungary and Byzantine territory. Despite friction with Emperor Isaac II, Frederick's army moved with discipline and crushed Turkish forces at Iconium in May 1190. But triumph turned to tragedy. On June 10th, while crossing the Salif River in Cilicia, Frederick drowned, his death sudden and mysterious. German morale collapsed, and only a fraction of his once mighty force continued under his son, Frederick of Swabia. Meanwhile, the Anglo-French contingent took to the sea. Philip and Richard raised special taxes, known as the Saladin Tithe, to finance the crusade. They met in Vézelay in July 1190, then headed to Sicily to winter and prepare. But their partnership was uneasy. Richard, ever bold, aggressively bargained with Tancred, the local Sicilian ruler, eventually taking what he needed by force. Philip, more reserved, resented Richard's assertiveness. The rift deepened when Richard publicly broke his engagement to Philip's sister, Alice, announcing instead that he would marry Berengaria of Navarre. With trust already fraying, their alliance became brittle. Richard's fleet left Sicily in April 1191, but was battered by storms. Some of his ships wrecked on Cyprus, then under the control of Isaac Komnenos, a rebellious Byzantine governor. Isaac imprisoned the survivors and seized their goods. Richard responded with swift vengeance. In May 1191, he launched a surprise campaign, capturing Cyprus in a matter of weeks. This unexpected conquest was a masterstroke. It provided the Crusaders with a secure, strategically placed base of operations. Richard sold the island to the Templars, who later handed it to Guy of Lusignan, creating a new Latin kingdom that would endure for centuries. Finally, Richard arrived at Acre in June 1191. The city had been under siege since 1189, and Crusader forces, including those under Philip and local barons, were still struggling to capture it. Now, with the arrival of Richard the Lionheart, one of the most legendary sieges of the medieval world would enter its decisive phase. The siege of Acre presented a formidable challenge to the Crusaders. Inside the city, the Muslim garrison fought with unwavering determination, while outside, Saladin's field army harassed the besiegers relentlessly. But everything changed with the arrival of Richard the Lionheart in 1191. A seasoned commander with a flair for battlefield tactics and siege warfare, Richard's leadership reinvigorated the campaign. Under his direction, operations accelerated rapidly, and on July 12th, Acre finally surrendered. The terms seemed clear. The garrison would be spared in exchange for 200,000 gold pieces, the release of Christian prisoners, and the return of the true cross. But this triumph also marked the beginning of disunity. King Philip Augustus of France, citing illness and political duties in his homeland, abruptly departed on July 31st. Though he left troops behind, morale suffered, and Richard was left as the sole monarch leading the crusade. Then, tensions reached a boiling point. When the ransom terms were not met in time, Richard, furious and impatient, ordered the execution of nearly 2,700 Muslim prisoners. The mass killing stunned even his allies and galvanized Saladin's determination to resist. With Acre secured, Richard pressed south toward Jerusalem. Saladin shadowed his march, biding his time. On September 7th, near Arsuf, he struck. The Crusaders were marching in tight formation when Saladin launched a full-scale assault. Richard held his ground, resisting repeated cavalry charges until the perfect moment, then unleashed a brutal counterattack. The field was cleared. Arsuf was a resounding Crusader victory, enhancing Richard's reputation and securing a temporary edge. Yet Jerusalem remained elusive. Richard advanced cautiously, fortifying Jaffa as a base and considering every logistical angle. But illness, bad weather, stretched supply lines, and internal disputes took their toll. Twice in 1192, he moved within striking distance of Jerusalem, once in January and again in June, reaching the village of Beit Nuba, just 12 miles from the city's walls. And twice, he turned back. The decision was strategic. Richard believed that without firm control of coastal supply lines and fortresses, taking Jerusalem would be meaningless. It could not be held. This view put him at odds with many crusaders, who yearned to see the holy city reclaimed, regardless of the risks. While the army chafed at inaction, Richard focused on strengthening coastal fortresses like Ascalon. As the campaign dragged on, both Richard and Saladin began to feel the burden of endless war. In England, Richard's brother John was stirring trouble. Philip Augustus was expanding his ambitions in France. Saladin, too, faced political resistance and war fatigue among his troops. Despite never meeting face-to-face, the two great commanders developed a grudging respect. Their negotiations, conducted through trusted envoys, grew more serious. In September 1192, after a final display of military prowess in the successful defense of Jaffa, Richard and Saladin agreed to a truce, the Treaty of Jaffa. It established a 3-year peace. The Crusaders would retain control of the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. Unarmed Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit Jerusalem. The city itself, however, would remain under Muslim control. For all its bloodshed and brilliance, the Third Crusade ended not in triumph, but in compromise. The Holy City remained beyond reach, yet the Crusader states endured, and the dream of reclaiming Jerusalem would continue to stir hearts in Europe for generations to come. The Crusaders never reclaimed Jerusalem during the Third Crusade, but they did prevent total collapse. Following the devastating loss at Hattin, the Latin Christian presence in the Levant teetered on the brink. Yet by 1192, the coastal cities had been recovered, forming the heart of a reconstituted, though diminished, Kingdom of Jerusalem. On October 9, 1192, Richard the Lionheart began his journey home. But fate had one more twist. Storms forced his ship ashore in hostile territory ruled by Duke Leopold of Austria, a political rival. Traveling in disguise, Richard was recognized, captured, and sold to Emperor Henry VI. Held for over a year, his release in March 1194 came only after a massive ransom. Despite its failure to retake the Holy City, the Third Crusade had proven the military strength of the West. It bought another century of Christian presence in the region, but also laid bare the limits of the crusading system itself. Coordinating multiple armies across nations, maintaining supply chains from Europe to the Levant, and aligning religious ideals with realpolitik, these were obstacles no sword could cut through. Still, the Third Crusade ignited powerful narratives. In Europe, Richard's daring became the stuff of legend. He earned the name Lionheart, his feats woven into songs, poems, and chivalric tales. His respectful rivalry with Saladin, two titans locked in honorable struggle, set a precedent for noble warfare that resonated through centuries of Western military thought. In the Islamic world, Saladin's defense of Jerusalem and his chivalry and victory made him an icon. His unification of Egypt and Syria under the Ayyubid dynasty reshaped the Middle East. Though his empire faltered after his death in March 1193, just months after Richard's departure, his legacy endured. The Third Crusade marked the zenith of traditional crusading, massive monarch-led campaigns aimed directly at Jerusalem. But that model was already fraying. The next crusade would prove just how far the movement had drifted from its original ideals. The Fourth Crusade began with noble purpose and ended in catastrophe. Instead of marching on Jerusalem, the Crusaders diverted and attacked Constantinople, Christendom's greatest city. What began as a holy mission descended into opportunism, greed, and betrayal. It exposed the uncomfortable truth that religious fervor alone could no longer define these wars. By the early 13th century, crusading had become a tool manipulated by politics and economics as much as faith. At the heart of this shift stood Pope Innocent III. Just 37 when he assumed the papacy in 1198, Innocent possessed a bold vision to restore papal authority over all of Christendom. He saw the next crusade not just as a holy war, but as a centerpiece of his reform agenda. In August of that year, he issued the Bull Post Miserabile, calling for a new campaign, this time with a clear-eyed strategy. Egypt, he believed, held the key to Jerusalem. Conquer Egypt, and the path to the Holy City would open. It was a logical, calculated move, but logic alone could not predict the chaos that would follow. By the turn of the 13th century, the focus of crusading strategy had shifted. The Pope now saw Egypt, not Jerusalem, as the key to winning the Holy Land. Egypt was the economic powerhouse of the Muslim world, and from a military standpoint, it was more vulnerable than the heavily fortified cities of Syria or Palestine. Conquering it first would strangle Muslim resistance at its source. But plans don't win wars. People do. And at first, recruitment lagged. That is, until a tournament in Champagne in November 1199 changed everything. There, amid the spectacle and chivalry, several powerful French nobles, including Count Thibaut of Champagne and Count Baldwin of Flanders, took the cross. Thibaut was named leader, but his sudden death in 1201 passed command to Boniface of Montferrat, an Italian nobleman with deep ties to Byzantium and the Crusader states. Early in the planning stages, the Crusaders made a key decision. Rather than struggle overland through hostile Anatolia, they would sail. And to do that, they needed ships, lots of them. Venice, the unrivaled maritime power of the Mediterranean, became their natural ally. In March 1201, Crusade envoys signed a massive contract with Doge Enrico Dandolo, the 85-year-old ruler of Venice, part statesman, part merchant prince, and still sharp as a dagger. Venice would build a fleet capable of transporting over 33,000 men and 4,500 horses, feed them for 9 months, and throw in 50 war galleys for good measure. The Cartier, a staggering 85,000 silver marks. But when June 1202 arrived, disaster struck. Barely a third of the expected army showed up in Venice. Some had taken other routes. Others had simply quit. Those who did arrive were left holding the bill. Even after selling off everything they could, they were still 34,000 marks short. Venice, which had shut down trade to fulfill the deal, was financially bleeding. Then Dandolo made a controversial offer. The Crusaders could delay payment if they helped Venice capture Zara, a rebellious city on the Dalmatian coast now under the protection of Hungary. But there was a problem. Hungary's king had taken the crusading vow himself. Attacking Zara meant attacking a fellow Christian. Pope Innocent III forbade the plan. He warned of excommunication. But the desperate Crusaders pressed forward. In October 1202, they sailed. By November, Zara fell after a brief siege. The Pope kept his word, excommunicating the entire expedition. Only later did he soften, lifting the penalty for the French Crusaders, but not for the Venetians. As the army wintered in Zara, uncertain of its next move, a new opportunity arrived. Envoys from a young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, made an offer that would change everything. His father, Isaac II, had been the Byzantine emperor until his brother Alexios III overthrew and blinded him in 1195. The younger Alexios had escaped west, and now he proposed a deal. If the Crusaders would help restore his father to the throne, he would pay them richly, supply troops for the Holy Land, and even reunite the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. It was an offer too grand to ignore, but by accepting it, the Crusaders would steer the entire campaign away from Egypt, away from Jerusalem, and straight into the heart of Constantinople. When the Crusaders agreed to support young Prince Alexios Angelos in reclaiming his father's throne, they were promised the world. 200,000 silver marks, a Byzantine army to fight alongside them in Egypt, funds to maintain 500 knights in the Holy Land, and perhaps most boldly of all, Alexios vowed to reunite the Greek Orthodox Church with Rome under papal authority, ending the centuries-long Christian schism. It was a tempting offer, but not everyone was convinced. Within the Crusader camp, voices of doubt rose, especially from those still loyal to the Crusades' original purpose. The Cistercians and other devout knights had come to fight Muslims, not meddle in Byzantine politics. Yet others, like Boniface of Montferrat and the Venetians, argued this detour would save the crusade from collapse. It promised money, ships, troops, and a moral justification, however shaky. The deal went through, but at a cost. A sizable portion of the Crusader army refused to go any further and returned home or sailed directly for the Holy Land. The rest departed for Constantinople in April 1203. When they arrived in June, they were met not with battle, but with awe. Constantinople was a marvel of its age. Its towering walls and glittering domes rivaled anything in the West. Home to perhaps 500,000 people, it dwarfed any European city. But beneath its splendor lay rot. Emperor Alexios III had allowed the navy to decay and the army to languish. His rule bred resentment among the people. On July 17th, the Crusaders struck. The Venetians broke through the harbor chain and stormed the shoreline near the imperial palace. Knights clashed with Byzantine forces outside the walls. Though they failed to breach the city, the feeble defense convinced Alexios III that his time was up. He fled in the night, taking the treasury with him. In a sudden reversal, Isaac II was restored, and his son crowned as Alexios IV. The Crusaders, now technically victorious, set up camp across the Golden Horn. But the victory was hollow. The Byzantines didn't have the silver they'd promised. What funds remained had vanished with the fleeing emperor. To pay the Crusaders, Alexios IV began confiscating church property and levying special taxes. It wasn't enough. Worse, it infuriated the population. And his promise to reunite with Rome, it sparked outrage. The Orthodox clergy denounced him. The people felt betrayed. The foreign troops, the heavy taxes, the religious concessions, it was too much. As the months dragged on, tension boiled. In December 1203, riots broke out. A fire spread through the city, destroying homes and stoking anti-Latin hatred. The fragile trust between East and West shattered. By January 1204, the anger could no longer be contained. The people of Constantinople rose in revolution. And once again, the Crusaders stood before a Christian city on the edge of collapse. In the early months of 1204, the delicate alliance between the Crusaders and the Byzantine court collapsed in dramatic fashion. A court official named Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Mortzoflos for his thick, prominent eyebrows, seized power in a violent coup. He imprisoned the young co-emperor, Alexios IV, and reinstated open resistance against the Crusaders. Within days, Alexios IV was strangled in his cell, and his blind father, Isaac II, died of shock. Mortzoflos crowned himself Emperor Alexios V and wasted no time fortifying Constantinople's defenses and ordering direct attacks on the Crusader encampment. For the Crusader leaders, this was a turning point. Their supposed ally was dead, the new regime was openly hostile, and their long-stalled mission stood at the brink of failure. Facing dwindling supplies and unable to turn back, the Crusaders and their Venetian allies made a fateful choice. They would take Constantinople by force. In March 1204, a treaty was drafted between the Crusaders and Venetians, detailing how the spoils of the city would be divided. It also established procedures for selecting a new Latin emperor and placed the appointment of the Patriarch in Venetian hands. Theologians were called upon to justify the decision, portraying the Byzantines as traitors to Christendom who had murdered their rightful ruler and broken their promise of church unity. The moral line had been redrawn. On April 9th, the Crusaders launched their first assault on the sea walls of Constantinople. Byzantine defenders repelled the attack, and for a brief moment, disaster seemed imminent. But on April 12th, the wind shifted, literally and figuratively. Venetian ships, aided by favorable gusts, maneuvered close enough to deploy specially built bridges that spanned to the city's walls. Crusaders fought their way up the sides, established small footholds, and opened the gates from within. By that afternoon, the thousand-year-old Byzantine Empire was effectively doomed. Emperor Alexios V fled the capital. The next day, April 13th, Crusaders entered Constantinople, not as guests or allies, but as conquerors. What followed was 3 days of looting, destruction, and savagery that appalled even hardened medieval observers. The Venetians, disciplined and methodical, focused on transporting portable wealth and religious artifacts. Chief among them, the 4 bronze horses that would later stand atop the facade of San Marco Cathedral in Venice. The Crusader rank and file, however, showed no such restraint. Churches were stripped bare. Sacred relics were seized or destroyed. Nuns were raped in their convents. Sacred chalices were used in drinking bouts. The great church of Hagia Sophia, for centuries the heart of Eastern Christianity, was desecrated. Its altar smashed, its golden iconostases melted down, and its hallowed nave transformed into a den of drunken revelry. Crusader chroniclers themselves confessed to the horrors. Geoffroy de Villehardouin admitted that no city in the world had ever yielded so much plunder. Robert de Clary claimed the wealth taken from Constantinople surpassed that of all Western Europe combined. But beyond gold and relics, the sack inflicted deep cultural wounds. Priceless manuscripts, statues, and ancient documents were consumed in flames or mindless destruction. While some artifacts made their way to Venice and other Western cities, planting the seeds of Renaissance interest in antiquity, much was simply lost to time. In the aftermath, the Crusaders formalized their conquest. Baldwin of Flanders was crowned emperor of the newly formed Latin Empire of Constantinople on May 16, 1204. The city and its surrounding territories were partitioned among the victors, dividing the former Byzantine world into Crusader kingdoms, Venetian colonies, and fragmented Greek successor states now forced into exile. What had begun as a holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem had ended in the brutal sacking of Christendom's greatest city by fellow Christians. The Fourth Crusade would be remembered not for its piety, but for its plunder. The Latin Empire, born from the wreckage of the Fourth Crusade, proved fragile and short-lived. Besieged from every side, by Bulgarian forces, by Orthodox resistance from the exiled Byzantine courts of Nicaea and Epirus, it never gained true legitimacy. In 1261, just 6 decades after the fall of Constantinople, Michael VIII Palaiologos, ruler of the Empire of Nicaea, retook the city and restored the Byzantine Empire. Though diminished, this reborn Byzantium would endure for nearly 2 more centuries, until the Ottomans finally breached its walls in 1453. Yet the legacy of the Latin conquest was far more than political. It was deeply moral and spiritual. Pope Innocent III had initially welcomed the news of Constantinople's capture. For him, it seemed a divine opportunity to reunify the Christian world under Rome through the appointment of a Latin patriarch. But that hope quickly soured, as reports of the horrific atrocities, looting, massacres, desecration, reached Rome. Innocent's tone changed dramatically. In letters to the Crusades' leaders, he condemned the attack on fellow Christians. How, he asked bitterly, can the Greek Church be brought back into union when she has suffered so much persecution, sees in the Latins only ruin, and now detests them more than dogs? Despite his moral outrage, the Pope did not renounce the Latin Empire. Instead, he attempted to consolidate papal authority over it, a decision that revealed the competing demands on medieval popes. Uphold Christian virtue while preserving political influence. For Eastern Christians, the Fourth Crusade was not just a betrayal, it was a trauma. The sack of Constantinople confirmed their darkest suspicions about the West's intentions. Instead of healing the East-West divide, the Crusade deepened it beyond repair. Generations later, as the Ottomans advanced, many Orthodox subjects would declare they would rather see the Sultan's turban in Constantinople than the Pope's tiara. For Western Europe, the Crusade was a paradox. It demonstrated the strategic and naval power of Latin Christendom, especially Venice, which emerged as the biggest winner, seizing new trade routes and territories, and accelerating its rise as the dominant maritime republic of the Mediterranean. But it also marked a profound moral collapse. The sack of Christendom's greatest city, committed by Christians against Christians, shattered the spiritual foundation of crusading. Future crusades would struggle to regain the moral clarity and religious fervor of earlier campaigns. The cultural impact was vast. Wealth, relics, and art flowed westward. Churches across Europe were filled with stolen treasures. In Italy especially, Byzantine influence would shape art, theology, and philosophy, helping lay the cultural foundations of the Renaissance. Yet the most enduring consequence was strategic. Byzantium, once a powerful buffer between Europe and the Islamic world, was now weakened. A vacuum opened in the Eastern Mediterranean. Into that void stepped the rising Ottoman Empire. And when the Christian world might have needed unity most, it was still reeling from betrayal. The Fourth Crusade thus stands as a turning point, where the lofty ideals of faith collided violently with ambition, greed, and political necessity. What began as a mission to liberate Jerusalem ended in the destruction of Constantinople. It is a reminder that in the tangled world of medieval Christendom, the line between sacred and profane was never clear, and sometimes fatally crossed. The Fourth Crusade didn't just fail, it shattered the fragile unity of Christendom. What had begun as a sacred mission to reclaim Jerusalem and ended in the brutal sack of Constantinople, the beating heart of Eastern Christianity. The Crusaders, instead of fighting Muslims, had laid siege to fellow Christians. The implications were seismic. Although Western Europe gained a stronger foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean, the spiritual credibility of the crusading movement was devastated. Pope Innocent III, the very man who had championed the expedition, now found himself presiding over a nightmare. Crusading had been twisted into something unrecognizable. In response, Innocent launched a bold reform. In November 1215, he convened the Fourth Lateran Council, the largest ecclesiastical assembly of the entire medieval era. Over 400 bishops, 800 abbots, and numerous secular rulers gathered to address not only church corruption and heresy, but also to chart a new, purer course for crusading. Innocent sought to realign the movement with its original spiritual intent. A new decree, ad liberandum, outlined a strategic, tightly controlled crusade. Egypt would once again be the target. Rich and militarily vital, it was the linchpin of Muslim power in the region. To finance this holy war, Innocent imposed a 3-year tax on the church, prohibited all trade with Muslim territories, and ordered multiple departure points to prevent the kind of disastrous bottlenecks that had plagued the Fourth Crusade. But perhaps the most revolutionary change was this: the crusade would be led not by kings, but by the papacy itself. A papal legate, not a monarch, would hold supreme command, ensuring that political ambition could no longer hijack religious purpose. Yet Innocent did not live to see his vision come to life. He died in July 1216, and the responsibility passed to his successor, Honorius III. Recruitment began across Europe, but the response was tepid. Philip II of France, remembering the chaos of earlier campaigns, stayed aloof. England's young Henry III was consumed by domestic unrest, and Emperor Frederick II, though he took the cross, continually delayed his departure, citing endless political obligations. With the great kings absent, leadership passed to a group of lesser but earnest nobles: Andrew II of Hungary, Leopold VI of Austria, and John of Brienne, who ruled the tiny remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem from Acre. Andrew II was the first to arrive in the Holy Land in late 1217. But to the frustration of local commanders, Andrew's idea of crusading centered more on collecting holy relics and visiting sacred sites than on waging war. After a handful of inconclusive skirmishes, he declared his vow fulfilled and sailed home in January 1218, taking much of his force with him. It was an uninspiring beginning to a crusade that had been so carefully planned. Yet all was not lost. With Andrew gone, more focused leadership emerged under Leopold and John of Brienne, men ready to carry out the military objectives their monarchs had abandoned. The stage was now set for the Fifth Crusade, one driven not by kings, but by papal vision and the hope of redemption. In the spring of 1218, a new wave of crusaders, reinforced by men from Germany, Italy, France, and England, landed on the shores of Egypt. This time the plan was clear: follow the strategy laid out by the Fourth Lateran Council and strike at the heart of Muslim power. Egypt. Their target was Damietta, a fortified port city guarding the eastern branch of the Nile Delta. Damietta wasn't just a gateway to Cairo. It was a hub of trade, a defensive stronghold, and the key to controlling the river routes of Egypt. Capturing it could force the Sultan, Al-Kamil, Saladin's brother and successor, to negotiate the return of Jerusalem. The siege began with a bold engineering challenge. The city's harbor was protected by a massive tower connected to a giant chain stretched across the Nile. After several failed attacks, Crusader engineers devised a creative solution. They lashed 2 ships together, mounted a scaling ladder between them, and launched a daring assault in August 1218. The tower fell, and the river defenses were broken. But Damietta itself refused to surrender. The Crusaders set up a fortified camp and braced for a long siege. Egypt's sweltering climate, disease, and seasonal flooding took a heavy toll. Meanwhile, inside the city, conditions worsened, supplies dwindled, morale broke, and death crept through the streets. Reinforcements continued to arrive at the Crusader camp. One of the most important figures to appear was Cardinal Pelagius, appointed by Pope Honorius III. As papal legate, Pelagius wielded enormous authority. He quickly clashed with John of Brienne, the military commander, asserting control over the campaign's direction. This power struggle would prove costly. Amid the violence, one man came with a different mission. Francis of Assisi, founder of the Franciscan order, crossed into enemy territory in September 1219. He sought peace, not conquest. According to contemporary accounts, Sultan Al-Kamil received him with honor, listened to his message, and returned him safely. It was a quiet moment of dialogue in an age of war. Finally, after 18 grueling months, Damietta collapsed in November 1219. Starvation and disease had reduced its population from 60,000 to less than 10,000. When the Crusaders entered, they found a ghost city, streets filled with corpses, homes empty, defenses intact but morale shattered. The capture of Damietta was the greatest triumph of the Fifth Crusade. It delivered what the Fourth Crusade had failed to achieve, a strategic foothold in Egypt. Then came an extraordinary turn. Fearing for Cairo, Sultan al-Kamil made a stunning offer: complete restoration of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, including the Holy City itself, in exchange for a peaceful Crusader withdrawal from Egypt. No battles, no bloodshed, just a return to the Holy Land. It was a moment that could have changed history, but instead of immediate celebration, the offer ignited bitter debate. Should they accept peace now or push forward toward Cairo? What happened next would determine whether the Fifth Crusade ended in triumph or in tragedy. In the early 1220s, the Fifth Crusade stood at a pivotal crossroads. Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt made a stunning offer. Jerusalem would be returned to Christian hands if the Crusaders agreed to withdraw from Egypt. It was a proposal that could have restored the heart of the Christian kingdom without further bloodshed. King John of Brienne, along with many secular leaders and members of the military orders, supported accepting it. They recognized the logistical nightmare of holding territory deep in Egypt and saw Jerusalem's restoration as the very goal of their holy war. But Cardinal Pelagius, the papal legate and de facto leader of the crusade, refused. With more reinforcements arriving from Europe, he remained convinced that Egypt could be fully conquered. Some historians believe he feared the offer was a trap, that al-Kamil would renege once the Crusaders left Egypt. Others point to direct papal instructions that prioritized total victory over negotiation. Whatever his reasoning, Pelagius's rejection of the offer is now considered one of the most consequential diplomatic failures in the history of the Crusades. Jerusalem, the spiritual and symbolic center of Christendom, was within reach, and yet it slipped away, not to defeat, but to indecision and internal division. Instead of advancing, the Crusaders lingered in the captured city of Damietta for nearly a year, enjoying its comforts and debating next steps. This delay proved fatal. Al-Kamil used the time wisely, reinforcing Cairo's defenses, rebuilding his armies, and, crucially, reconciling with his estranged brothers, Al-Mu'azzam of Damascus and Al-Ashraf of Upper Mesopotamia. A united Muslim front now faced the Crusaders. In July 1221, despite growing doubts and protests from King John, Cardinal Pelagius ordered the army, now swelled with troops from Bavaria and still hoping for the long-promised arrival of Emperor Frederick II, to march on Cairo. Following the eastern branch of the Nile, they advanced southward, capturing the fortress of Sharamsah and setting camp near the village of Al-Adiliya, just outside Mansoura. The terrain seemed favorable, but it held a deadly secret. The Crusader position lay in lowland between the Nile and a network of canals, a region notorious for its seasonal flooding. Sultan al-Kamil, well-versed in Egypt's topography and climate, recognized this weakness immediately. As the Crusaders prepared for their final push toward Cairo, the Sultan acted. He ordered the Nile's dams broken. The river surged, water filled the fields around the Crusader camp, transforming their once confident position into a quagmire. With their army trapped on shrinking islands of dry land and the Egyptian navy cutting off any retreat to Damietta, the Crusaders' campaign turned from offensive operation to desperate survival. Supplies dwindled, morale collapsed. With no path forward and no way back, Pelagius was forced to negotiate. The terms were humiliating. The Crusaders had to evacuate all of Egypt, including the prized city of Damietta. They were granted an 8-year truce and received in return only a supposed relic of the true cross. Worse still, they were required to release all Muslim prisoners without securing the return of their own. On September 8, 1221, the broken remnants of the Crusader army began their withdrawal. What had begun with high hopes and early triumphs ended in a comprehensive defeat, one made all the more painful by the fact that Jerusalem had once again been within reach. The failure of the Fifth Crusade underscored a hard truth. Even sound strategy can collapse under poor leadership, internal rivalries, and failure to seize the moment. Though the idea of targeting Egypt to pressure Muslim powers had merit, the opportunity was squandered. The dream of reclaiming the Holy Land would now pass to others. The Fifth Crusade ended not with a victory, but a sobering lesson in leadership failure. Despite ambitious planning, the execution fell apart due to divided command, slow decision-making, and a series of tactical errors during the campaign in Egypt. The papacy had hoped that by placing the expedition under direct control through its legate, Cardinal Pelagius, it could overcome the failings of past secular-led crusades. But in practice, this structure led to more confusion, not less. Pelagius's critics pointed to his military inexperience and his rejection of generous peace offers. His supporters blamed John of Brienne's hesitancy and the long-anticipated absence of Frederick II, whose promised forces might have shifted the balance. Modern historians see a tangle of problems: poor coordination after the capture of Damietta, underestimation of Egypt's geography and climate, and a general lack of cohesive strategy. The Fifth Crusade had been one of the most carefully organized endeavors in crusading history, yet the effort collapsed under the weight of its own bureaucracy. For the papacy, it was a disappointing return on years of preparation and immense institutional investment. But not all was lost. In the aftermath, the Templars and Hospitallers, the military orders, rose in prominence. With their permanent presence in the Holy Land and their growing expertise in both warfare and diplomacy, they began to dominate defensive efforts between major crusades. Back in Europe, the Fifth Crusade deepened doubts about the viability of crusading. Out of 5 major expeditions, only the first had succeeded in lasting conquest. A pattern was emerging, one of diminishing returns. Many began rethinking the very idea of crusading. Instead of vast armies marching east, thinkers and strategists looked to targeted expeditions, diplomatic alliances, and new battlefronts in regions like the Baltic and the Iberian Peninsula. Meanwhile, the Muslim world, especially the Ayyubid dynasty under Sultan al-Kamil, had shown not just military strength, but diplomatic sophistication. Al-Kamil, having defended Egypt successfully, came to see negotiation as a more effective tool than open warfare. This philosophy would shape his interaction with a most unusual adversary in the next campaign, Emperor Frederick II. The Sixth Crusade would be unlike any before it. It achieved more through diplomacy than the past 5 had through combat. And at its center stood one of the most remarkable figures of the medieval world. Frederick II, King of Sicily at just 3 years old, King of Germany at 18, and Holy Roman Emperor by 26, ruled a realm stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. Educated in the vibrant multicultural court of Palermo, he spoke several languages, studied science and philosophy, and cultivated a reputation as a scholar king. His contemporaries called him Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. Frederick's path to crusading began formally in 1220, when he took the cross at his imperial coronation. But it became deeply personal in 1225 when he married Isabella II of Jerusalem. With that union, he became not only the Emperor of the West, but the titular King of Jerusalem, with a claim to the Holy City itself. Unlike previous crusaders who marched under papal banners and sought glory in battle, Frederick would take a radically different approach. He would challenge not only Muslim powers, but papal expectations, and in doing so, redefine what crusading could mean in a changing world. Frederick II had vowed to lead a crusade, but delay after delay tested the patience of the papacy. At first, Pope Honorius III tolerated his excuses: internal unrest, wars in northern Italy, the complex realities of ruling a vast empire. But when Frederick again postponed his departure in 1227, claiming illness, the new pope, Gregory XIX, ran out of patience. The result was extraordinary. The Holy Roman Emperor, now excommunicated, prepared to lead a papal crusade without papal blessing. In June 1228, Frederick finally set sail for the Holy Land, not with a grand army but a modest force of around 800 knights and 10,000 infantry. Upon his arrival, the political landscape of the Levant played unexpectedly in his favor. Sultan al-Kamil, the same ruler who had crushed the Fifth Crusade, now faced his own succession crisis within the fractious Ayyubid dynasty. His brother, the ruler of Damascus, had died the previous year, sparking a family power struggle. Al-Kamil found himself needing allies, and Frederick, despite his excommunication, offered a powerful one. Years earlier, the two men had already exchanged envoys, gifts, and philosophical correspondence. Unlike most Western rulers, Frederick was a man of culture and intellect. He spoke Arabic, welcomed Muslim scholars at his court, and genuinely admired Islamic learning. To many Europeans, these qualities made him suspect. But in the Levant, they gave him a unique edge. When he landed in Acre in September 1228, Frederick's reception was cold. The Templars and Hospitallers accompanied his expedition but refused to fully cooperate. Church leaders, including Patriarch Gerald of Jerusalem, rejected his authority altogether. But Frederick pressed forward, not with armies but with diplomacy. He initiated direct negotiations with Al-Kamil. The exact content of their talks remains unclear, but both rulers had good reason to seek a deal. Frederick needed a symbolic victory to restore his reputation in Europe. Al-Kamil needed breathing room from his rivals. After 5 months of quiet negotiation, the two men signed the Treaty of Jaffa on February 18, 1229. What generations of warriors had failed to win through bloodshed, Frederick gained through words. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth were returned to Christian hands, along with a corridor to the coast. In return, Muslims retained access to the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, and both sides agreed to a 10-year truce. Frederick even pledged to protect Al-Kamil from all enemies, including other Christians. Reactions were sharply divided. To his supporters, Frederick was a visionary, a ruler who restored Christianity's most sacred sites without a drop of blood. To his critics, he had compromised with the enemy and allowed Muslim worship to continue in the Holy City. On March 17, 1229, Frederick entered Jerusalem as its Christian ruler. It should have been a triumphant moment, but there were no cheers from the church, no bishops, no mass, no ceremony. Because of his excommunication, the clergy refused to bless his rule. There he stood, victorious yet isolated, a monarch crowned without a crown. His success was undeniable, but it raised profound questions about the nature of crusading, authority, and what it meant to reclaim the Holy Land. In the spring of 1229, inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, something unprecedented occurred. Emperor Frederick II, excommunicated and politically isolated, placed the crown of Jerusalem on his own head. No bishop presided over the ceremony. No papal blessing was granted. It was an act of defiance, but also of vision. Frederick had just secured Jerusalem through diplomacy, not war. And though many in the West condemned him, his achievement was undeniable. During his short stay in the Holy City, Frederick showed the qualities that had always set him apart. He wasn't just a warrior king. He was a scholar, a polyglot, a man of deep curiosity. He conversed with Muslim philosophers, admired the intricacies of Islamic architecture, and promised Muslim leaders he would honor their holy places. To some, it was heresy. To others, it was progress. But then came a bitter twist. While Frederick was peacefully reclaiming Jerusalem, Pope Gregory IX had declared a crusade against Frederick himself. Papal forces invaded his Italian territories, creating one of the strangest spectacles in crusading history. Christians fighting Christians while the Holy City returned to Christian hands. Forced to act, Frederick cut his stay short and returned to Italy in May 1229. Before leaving, he put administrative structures in place, appointing Balian of Sidon as his representative and ordering the reconstruction of Jerusalem's walls. These were not gestures. They were practical safeguards meant to protect a fragile peace. Back in Italy, Frederick swiftly defeated the papal armies. The balance of power shifted. In 1230, the Treaty of San Germano brought reconciliation. The excommunication was lifted, and peace, at least temporarily, returned between emperor and pope. Jerusalem remained under Christian control for an impressive 15 years, longer than anyone had dared hope given the lack of military might. Pilgrims visited, peace held. But not all were pleased. Muslim hardliners viewed Sultan al-Kamil's treaty with Frederick as a betrayal. Still, the deal had worked, until it didn't. In 1238, al-Kamil died. The political equilibrium crumbled. Rival Muslim factions, especially Nasser Dawood of Damascus, seized lands near Jerusalem, breaking the treaty's terms. Western nobles, including Theobald IV of Champagne and Richard of Cornwall, launched modest campaigns, the so-called Barons' Crusades, to restore the peace. They achieved some success, but nothing lasting. Then came catastrophe. In 1244, Khwarezmian mercenaries, Turkish warriors driven west by Mongol invasions, stormed Jerusalem. They slaughtered the Christian population, burned churches, and desecrated sacred ground. The city was lost once more, and this time it would remain under Muslim control for centuries. Frederick's triumph, bold and visionary, had proven to be only temporary. Yet the legacy of the Sixth Crusade endures. It challenged the very meaning of crusading. Frederick didn't fight his way to victory, he reasoned his way there. He showed that negotiation, diplomacy, and mutual respect could sometimes achieve what armies could not. In an age of holy war, he dared to imagine holy peace. And though it did not last, the echo of that moment, when the holy city was regained without bloodshed, still resonates as a reminder of what might have been. Frederick II's crusade was unlike any that had come before, and none that followed would resemble it. While past crusades had marched east under banners of holy war and armed pilgrimage, Frederick pursued a radically different path. He treated the Muslim rulers of the region not as mortal enemies, but as negotiating partners. He respected Islamic culture, allowed Muslim worship within Jerusalem, and secured access to Christian holy sites not through bloodshed, but through diplomacy. In doing so, he directly contradicted the foundational principles of the crusading movement, principles that were built on religious antagonism and military confrontation. For the papacy, this was more than unconventional. It was heretical. Frederick was still excommunicated when he walked into Jerusalem in 1229 and claimed it for Christendom. The fact that an excommunicated emperor had accomplished what generations of papally endorsed crusaders had failed to do was nothing short of a theological and political embarrassment. Pope Gregory IX, instead of celebrating Frederick's success, declared a crusade against him and his territories. The language of holy war was now being used not only against Muslims, but against fellow Christians, revealing how deeply political the crusading institution had become. The broader crusading movement struggled to make sense of what Frederick had done. His achievement had broken the mold, demonstrating that Christian goals could be achieved through diplomacy and mutual recognition rather than force. But this lesson, as powerful as it was, would be ignored. Future crusades would revert to traditional methods, armies, sieges, and slaughter. Part of the reason was genuine religious conviction. Many still believed that only through holy warfare could spiritual merit be earned. But part of it was also practical. Frederick was an exceptional figure, charismatic, educated, multilingual, and politically shrewd. His success could not easily be replicated by others. And so, the insight his expedition had revealed, that Jerusalem could be reclaimed without war, was ultimately cast aside. Frederick himself never returned to the Holy Land. His remaining years were consumed by power struggles with successive popes as he fought to consolidate control over his European domains. By the time of his death in 1250, everything he had gained in the east was gone. In 1244, the Khwarezmian Turks, driven west by Mongol conquests, stormed Jerusalem. They slaughtered the city's Christian inhabitants and desecrated its sacred sites. The holy city that Frederick had once secured without bloodshed was now lost in a frenzy of violence. That same year, a coalition of Crusader states allied with Damascus attempted to push back at the Battle of Laforbi, but their forces were crushed by the combined armies of Egypt and the Khwarezmians. The scale of the defeat was staggering, worse even than the catastrophe at Hattin. In Europe with Tarar, the news arrived amid continuing papal conflict with Frederick II. Pope Innocent IV had declared the emperor deposed at the Council of Leon in 1245 and was now struggling to maintain his own authority. Yet despite the chaos, the loss of Jerusalem could not be ignored. Innocent issued new crusading bulls, calling for yet another effort to retake the city. And so the cycle began again. The Sixth Crusade had briefly illuminated another path, one paved with negotiation rather than destruction. But in a world still ruled by religious dogma and political rivalry, that path was quickly closed. What remained was a paradox. The most successful crusade in decades had been led by an emperor condemned by the church. And its greatest lesson, that peace could achieve what war could not, would be all but forgotten. By the mid-13th century, enthusiasm for crusading had faded among most European monarchs. Preoccupied with domestic politics or regional wars, few rulers answered the church's call. But one man did. Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, stepped forward with unwavering resolve. Born in 1214 and crowned at just 12 years old, Louis had already built a reputation for deep personal piety, exceptional administrative ability, and moral authority. His faith wasn't performative, it was profound. He attended multiple masses a day, practiced severe acts of self-denial, and even cared personally for lepers. To modern sensibilities, these acts may seem extreme, but to his contemporaries, they were the unmistakable signs of a ruler touched by God. His decision to launch a crusade came in 1244, following a near-fatal illness. After losing consciousness, Louis claimed to have made a solemn vow. If he recovered, he would lead an army to the Holy Land. Shortly after his recovery, word arrived that Jerusalem had once again fallen. For Louis, this was no coincidence, it was divine confirmation. Despite protests from his mother, Queen Blanche of Castile, and senior advisors, Louis refused to be swayed. His commitment was absolute. What followed was not a hasty march to the east, but a meticulous 4-year preparation for what would become the Seventh Crusade. Louis approached the expedition like a statesman and strategist. He imposed sweeping taxes, including an unprecedented levy on the church, a move that provoked fierce resistance but funded the campaign. He engaged in diplomacy, securing rights of passage from Emperor Frederick II, exploring alliances with Mongol leaders, and striking naval agreements with Genoa and Marseille to ensure safe and efficient transport. Louis had learned from history. He understood that past crusades had often failed due to poor logistics and insufficient planning. When his fleet finally sailed from Aigues Mortes on August 25, 1248, it carried roughly 15,000 men, including 2,500 knights, spread across 36 ships. Their destination? Cyprus. There, Louis and his army wintered, stockpiled supplies, trained and refined their strategy. And this time their focus wasn't Jerusalem, it was Egypt. The Ayyubid dynasty's heartland, Egypt was the economic and military engine of Muslim power. If Egypt could be taken, then Jerusalem might follow. Louis set his sights on Damietta, the strategic port city that controlled access to the Nile Delta and the routes to Cairo. On June 4, 1249, the Crusaders landed near Damietta under the watch of Egyptian troops. In one of the most iconic moments of the entire crusading era, Louis himself leapt from his ship into chest-deep water, sword raised, and led the charge ashore under enemy fire. His courage inspired his soldiers, and the beachhead was secured. Astonishingly, the very next day, Egyptian defenders fled Damietta. The city fell without a siege, intact and undamaged. It was a stroke of unexpected fortune, almost divine in timing. Louis immediately took control of the city, established an administrative base, and prepared for the next phase of the campaign, a march toward the Egyptian capital, Cairo. At that moment, it seemed as though the Seventh Crusade might rewrite history. Louis had done everything right. His planning was thorough, his faith was unshakable, and his army stood victorious at the gates of the Muslim world's greatest stronghold. But the challenges ahead would soon test even the most devout and determined king in Christendom. At a moment when speed could have been decisive, King Louis IX made a fateful decision: to wait. He chose to delay the advance on Cairo until his brother Alphonse of Poitiers could arrive with reinforcements. But the pause, stretching from June to November 1249, came at a high cost. It allowed the Egyptians to reinforce their defenses, prepare their armies, and exploit the approaching Nile flood season. In effect, the Crusaders were repeating the Fifth Crusade's fatal mistake: hesitation. In Egypt, a major shift was underway. Sultan al-Saleh Ayyub died in November, and his wife, the formidable Shajar al-Dur, hid his death until his son, Turan Shah, could return from Mesopotamia. This smooth transition of power denied the Crusaders any chance to exploit political chaos, revealing the depth and discipline of Egyptian governance. On November 20th, with Alphonse finally present, the full Crusader force moved out from Damietta toward Cairo, following the Damietta branch of the Nile. Their target? Mansoura, a city etched in Crusader memory for past failure. By December, they reached a canal opposite the city. There, the Egyptian army had entrenched itself on the far bank, barring the crossing. For nearly 2 months, the Crusaders attempted to build bridges, causeways, anything to force a passage. But Egyptian engineers and soldiers thwarted every effort, raining down missiles, launching sorties and even hurling Greek fire. Then, a breakthrough. On February 8, 1250, a local Coptic Christian revealed a shallow crossing point downstream. Louis sent his brother, Robert of Artois, along with the Templars and select knights, to secure a beachhead. They crossed successfully, but then Robert made a fatal choice. He charged directly into Mansoura, ignoring Louis's orders to wait. For a moment, it seemed a bold stroke. The Crusader cavalry broke into the city, sowing confusion. But their triumph was short-lived. The narrow alleys of Mansoura nullified cavalry strength. Egyptian forces, led by the Mamluk commander Baibars, regrouped and struck back. The Crusader vanguard was annihilated. Robert, William Longuespain, and hundreds of elite knights were killed. When Louis arrived with the main army, it was already too late. The vanguard was gone. Still, he managed to dig in and hold a defensive line outside the city. For 2 agonizing months, the two armies fought a grinding war of attrition. Egyptian control of the Nile cut off resupply from Damietta. The Crusader camp soon faced starvation. Scurvy and dysentery tore through the ranks. Accounts from the time speak of unimaginable suffering. Blackened gums, rotting flesh, unburied corpses. Louis himself fell gravely ill, but refused to abandon his men. By early April, the Crusader force was collapsing. On April 5th, Louis gave the order to retreat. But the retreat was not salvation. It was an ambush. Near the town of Fariscourt, Egyptian forces encircled the fleeing army. The Sixth Crusade, once filled with hope and ambition, was unraveling into catastrophe. The Seventh Crusade came to a dramatic and humiliating end. King Louis IX of France, weakened by illness and unable to ride, was captured alongside his brothers and most of the French nobility. The Muslim victors executed the majority of common soldiers, sparing only those with technical skills or ransom value. It was an unprecedented disaster. Never before had a reigning European monarch fallen prisoner to Muslim forces. Yet Louis displayed remarkable calm. Even in captivity, he upheld the dignity of his crown. After several tense weeks, a deal was struck. In exchange for the release of the king and his nobles, Louis would surrender the city of Damietta and pay a staggering ransom, 400,000 livres tournois, about 30 tons of silver. In practical terms, the campaign ended much like the Fifth Crusade, a total withdrawal from Egypt with no permanent gains. But symbolically, it was worse. The capture of a Christian king reverberated across Europe and the Islamic world. For Egypt, it was a triumph, proof that Western invasions could still be defeated despite internal instability. Most kings would have returned home after such a loss. Louis did not. Driven by faith and duty, he traveled to Acre, capital of the fractured kingdom of Jerusalem. He stayed not for weeks, but for years, 4 to be exact. No other European monarch had ever made such a commitment. During this time, Louis shifted his focus. He abandoned dreams of conquest and turned to preservation. He refortified the key coastal cities of Acre, Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sidon. He didn't just order the work, he joined it. Contemporary sources describe him carrying stones and mortar alongside common laborers, a powerful act of religious humility. But Louis was not only a builder, he was a diplomat. He exchanged letters with the Mongols, entertained envoys from the assassins, and negotiated with Muslim rulers for prisoner exchanges and safe pilgrimage routes. At home in France, he had been a reformer, and he brought that same energy to the Crusader states. He reorganized the courts, stabilized baronial power, and offered support to military orders. These efforts gave the Latin kingdoms a temporary reprieve. His presence also quelled the bitter factionalism that had plagued the Crusader leadership for decades. But in 1252, news arrived that changed everything. His mother, Blanche of Castile, regent of France during his absence, had died. Without her, France needed its king. Louis delayed as long as he could, but by April 1254, he boarded a ship and left Acre behind. Back in France, he carried with him the lessons of war, loss, and perseverance. He introduced judicial and administrative reforms shaped by his crusading experience and continued to support the Holy Land financially and diplomatically. Despite the military failure, Louis's reputation remained remarkably strong. Many contemporaries believed his defeat was not a failure of strategy, but a divine trial. In a world that often measured kings by their victories, Louis X was remembered for his devotion, his endurance, and his refusal to give up. Up, no matter the cost. Though the Seventh Crusade ended in defeat, its legacy would ripple far beyond the battlefield. At the heart of the campaign stood King Louis IX of France, a monarch driven not by ambition or glory, but by sincere piety and personal sacrifice. His motivations were recognized and revered, even by his critics. Yet the most enduring consequences of his crusade would not be felt in Europe, but in Egypt. As Louis withdrew from the Nile Delta in 1250, the Ayyubid Sultanate, already weakened by succession crises, crumbled. Into the vacuum stepped the Mamluks, elite slave soldiers of Turkish origin who had played a critical role in defeating the Crusaders at Mansoura. Under dynamic leaders like Baybars, who first rose to prominence during the conflict with Louis, the Mamluks seized control of Egypt and established a military regime that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. In many ways, Louis XIV's strategy reflected the institutional memory of earlier crusading ventures. Like the Fifth Crusade, he targeted Egypt as the key to unlocking Jerusalem. But unlike his predecessors, Louis approached the task with meticulous preparation and strategic caution. He invested heavily in logistics, insisted on defensive consolidation, and avoided premature offensives. For his contemporaries, this prudence, combined with unwavering devotion, made Louis the living embodiment of crusading virtue. Even in defeat, his personal sanctity endured. When he launched a second expedition in 1270, the Eighth Crusade, it further cemented his legacy as the ideal Christian king, a legacy so powerful it led to his canonization in 1297. But military virtue alone could not overcome geography. The Nile Delta, with its complex network of canals and annual floods, favored defenders and punished foreign armies unfamiliar with the terrain. Western tactics, reliant on direct confrontation, failed to adapt. In this sense, the Seventh Crusade revealed hard truths about the limits of European military power in the East. Strategically, Egypt faded as a primary target in later campaigns. Yet perhaps the greatest legacy of Louis's expedition lay in its unintended consequences. By destabilizing the Ayyubid order, it accelerated the rise of the Mamluks, a warrior elite whose sole purpose was to wage war against invaders like the Crusaders and later, the Mongols. Under their leadership, Muslim forces began a systematic campaign to dismantle the remaining Latin holdings. Ironically, while Louis had invested in reconstructing fortresses and stabilizing Crusader territories during his brief occupation, these gains were fleeting. His actions had helped preserve the Crusader states in the short term, but they also hastened their ultimate destruction. Baybars, who would become sultan, proved a master of both military strategy and political manipulation. Between 1265 and 1270, his campaigns devastated the Crusader position. Cities like Caesarea and Arsuf fell in 1265, followed by Safed and Tehran in 1266. The March 1268 capture of Jaffa dealt another blow, but it was the fall of Antioch in May that year that shocked the Christian world. Antioch, one of the original Crusader states founded after the First Crusade, was completely extinguished. By 1270, what remained of Christian control in the Levant was reduced to a few coastal enclaves, with Acre serving as a fragile capital of a fragmented realm. The Seventh Crusade thus exemplifies the paradoxes of crusading history. A king celebrated for holiness whose campaign strengthened his enemies. A strategy rooted in historical precedent that failed once more. And a defeat that reshaped the balance of power in the Mediterranean for generations. It reminds us that in the world of the Crusades, the gap between intention and outcome was often wide, and the forces unleashed by war could rarely be controlled. By the late 13th century, crusading zeal in Europe had all but faded. Years of defeat, disillusionment, and political fragmentation had taken their toll. Even as desperate appeals poured in from the Holy Land, warning of cities lost, populations massacred, and crusader states teetering, Europe's monarchs largely looked the other way. Not even the horrific fall of Antioch, where an estimated 17,000 were slaughtered and thousands more enslaved, could reignite the old fire. But one man still believed. King Louis IX of France, now in his 50s and weakened by age, remained utterly devoted to the crusading cause. Despite having already suffered capture and paid a king's ransom during the Seventh Crusade, Louis did not view his debt to Christendom as settled. In March 1267, he announced his intention to take up the cross once more. The decision surprised many. But Louis was driven not by political ambition or military pride, but by a profound sense of religious duty. Recruitment began among the French nobility. Some old veterans stepped forward eagerly. Others hesitated, haunted by bitter memories of the last campaign. To strengthen commitment, Louis secured crusading vows from his sons and brothers, transforming the expedition into a royal family affair, one that noble houses could scarcely refuse. As before, Louis planned meticulously. Taxes were levied anew, including unpopular assessments on both nobles and clergy. Supplies were stockpiled, ships commissioned. But unlike the previous crusade, preparation time was shorter, only 3 years instead of 4, and the French treasury was strained from years of subsidizing efforts in the Holy Land. A critical disagreement emerged during planning. Louis, consistent with traditional crusading aims, favored marching on Egypt or returning to Palestine. But his brother, Charles of Anjou, now ruler of Sicily, had other plans. He lobbied hard for an invasion of Tunis, offering several reasons. First, Tunis lay strategically along the North African coast and could serve as a launch point for operations against Egypt. Second, the city had defaulted on tribute payments owed to Charles, creating a compelling financial motive. And third, perhaps most controversially, there were whispers that the ruler of Tunis, Al-Mustansir, was contemplating conversion to Christianity. For Louis, this last point carried immense spiritual appeal. He viewed crusading as not just a matter of reclaiming lost Christian lands, but of advancing the faith itself. The chance to shepherd a Muslim ruler into the church seemed like divine purpose. And so, the destination was set. On July 1st, 1270, Louis' fleet set sail from Aigues-Mortes, carrying roughly 10,000 men. Genoese ships transported a diverse force, including nobles from France, Catalonia, Provence, and various Italian cities. After a short stop in Sardinia for coordination, the fleet arrived at the shores of ancient Carthage, just outside modern-day Tunis, on July 18th. But the scene that greeted them was not the hoped-for welcome of a curious ruler ready to embrace Christianity. There was no sign of Al-Mustansir's supposed spiritual openness. No ambassadors, no truce envoys. Instead, the Crusaders met immediate and determined military resistance. Whatever promises or hopes had been whispered before were either false or disastrously misinterpreted. The reality was clear. They had not landed to broker a conversion, but to wage a war. Age of pain. The Crusaders came ashore under a blazing North African sun, but the enemy was nowhere to be seen. Rather than confront the Crusaders in open battle, Hafsid forces harassed their landing and then withdrew. Louis XIX and his army secured the ruins of ancient Carthage, establishing a fortified camp on the elevated ground. From this position, Louis hoped to provoke the Hafsid ruler Muhammad al-Mustansir into a decisive engagement. But al-Mustansir had no intention of fighting on Crusader terms. He adopted a containment strategy, using the climate as his greatest weapon. And it worked. The searing heat of late July, combined with poor sanitation, bad water, and disease-carrying insects, turned the Crusader camp into a death trap. Dysentery swept through the ranks, claiming soldiers and commanders alike. Among the first to die was Louis's own son, John Tristan, ironically born during the failed Seventh Crusade in Damietta. Then came the death of the papal legate. By August 10th, Louis himself had fallen ill. Sources describe a flux of the stomach and high fever, almost certainly dysentery, perhaps worsened by typhus. Yet even as his body failed, Louis remained steadfast. He continued issuing orders, offering spiritual comfort, and praying. On August 25th, 1270, the king died in his tent. According to his confessor, he lay on a bed of ashes as a final act of humility. His last words, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem." With those 2 words, he expressed both his life's mission and its ultimate failure. His death plunged the crusade into crisis. His son and heir, Philip III, lay gravely ill. Leadership passed to Charles of Anjou, who arrived from Sicily the day after Louis's death. Realizing the army was broken by disease and demoralization, Charles negotiated a treaty with al-Mustansir. It was a face-saving agreement more than a victory. The Hafsids paid a large indemnity, improved conditions for Christian merchants, allowed missionary work, and resumed tribute to Sicily. But no lands changed hands. There was no triumph over Islam. No gains in Egypt. It was the shell of a crusade. In November, the shattered Crusader army prepared to leave. Louis's body would be carried home. But the disasters were not over. A violent storm struck the fleet near Trapani, Sicily. Several ships sank, around 4,000 men drowned, including King Thibaut II of Navarre, Louis's brother-in-law, and his daughter Isabella. Most surviving nobles abandoned the crusade and returned home, the idea of marching on the Holy Land all but forgotten. Philip III, having recovered, took his father's remains back to France. There, Louis was buried at Saint-Denis beside other French kings. Meanwhile, a young English prince, Edward, future King Edward I, arrived in North Africa, only to find the crusade already over. The Eighth Crusade had ended as it began, with ambition, suffering, and futility. Louis IX, once hailed as the perfect Crusader king, had died without ever reaching Jerusalem. After the Eighth Crusade collapsed in the heat and disease of North Africa, one man pressed on. Edward of England, future King Edward I, sailed with a smaller force to Acre in 1271. Historians sometimes call this brief campaign the Ninth Crusade. It accomplished little militarily, but it gave a fleeting boost to Crusader morale. A year later, Edward returned to England, and with that, the age of great crusades led by European monarchs was drawing to a quiet, inglorious end. The Eighth Crusade, meanwhile, had left a bitter legacy. It may have been the least effective of all major crusading efforts. Unlike earlier crusades that at least reached the Holy Land before faltering, Louis IX's final campaign never got that far. Whether Tunis was the real target or just a stepping stone to Egypt or Jerusalem, the outcome was the same: immense effort, tremendous cost, and no strategic gain. What stood out most to contemporaries was not victory or loss, but the death of Louis IX. The French king, long seen as the model of Christian piety, died far from Jerusalem, racked with disease, surrounded by failure. And yet, his death transformed him. In 1297, Pope Boniface VIII canonized him as Saint Louis. His crusading spirit became part of his sanctity, an image of a king who gave up everything for God. He became the ideal of Christian rulership: humble, faithful, willing to die for a higher cause. But ideals cannot outweigh reality. The Crusades' cost was staggering. Thousands of knights and nobles perished, many of them irreplaceable leaders, and the financial burden further drained the coffers of a weary Europe. The decision to sail for Tunis, likely influenced by Charles of Anjou's political and economic interests, diverted manpower that might have defended the crumbling Crusader states in the East. The Eighth Crusade revealed how much crusading had changed. It was no longer a unified march of faith. It was a tangled web of dynasties, diplomacy, and money. Even someone as devout as Louis IX found his mission shaped by his brother's ambitions. The gap between crusading ideals and real-world outcomes had never been wider. Ironically, the Hafsid rulers of Tunis may have been the biggest beneficiaries. Though briefly disrupted, they emerged with enhanced diplomatic stature. Their peace agreement with Charles of Anjou brought trade concessions and tribute arrangements that deepened their ties to Mediterranean powers. But while the West looked south, the real battlefield was elsewhere. In the Levant, Mamluk Sultan Baybars continued his relentless advance. From 1270 to 1271, he captured key Crusader strongholds, undeterred by events in North Africa. The Eighth Crusade had no impact on the strategic balance in the Holy Land. For the Crusader states, it was another missed opportunity, a call for help answered with misdirection. By the time Europe looked east again, it would be too late. The last great crusade had died on the shores of Carthage, alongside its saintly king. By the late 13th century, the rhythm of crusading had grown increasingly detached from the pressing realities of the Holy Land. Campaign after campaign focused on symbolic objectives, or ventures far removed from the survival needs of the remaining Crusader states. The Eighth Crusade exemplified this growing disconnect. Initiated by King Louis IX of France, the expedition never even reached the Levant. Instead, it targeted Tunis, a location with tenuous ties to the central conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean. While the campaign accomplished little militarily, its lasting impact lay in how it shaped Louis IX's posthumous legacy. Though he died of illness shortly after arriving in Tunisia, Louis's failure was alchemized into spiritual triumph. Through the narratives of hagiography, his final crusade was reframed as a model of Christian kingship, an act of selfless devotion. Louis became St. Louis, the ideal crusader king. This sanctified memory endured for centuries, especially in France, where it reinforced powerful links between monarchy, national identity, and divine mission. Yet behind the legend lay a more sobering truth. Louis's final expedition consumed vast resources, drew attention away from more urgent threats in the Levant, and failed to achieve any tangible goals. Like the crusading ideal itself, his campaign revealed the tension between spiritual aspiration and the harsh limits of political reality in a fractured, rapidly evolving world. The Ninth Crusade, often considered an informal continuation of the Eighth, marked the end of the classical age of crusading. It was led by Prince Edward of England, later King Edward I. Tall, commanding, and battle-hardened from campaigns in Wales, Edward had taken the cross during Louis IX's final recruitment effort. He arrived in Tunis in November 1270, only to find Louis dead and the French army preparing to sail home. Where others might have followed, Edward made a bold and solitary decision. He would continue on to the Holy Land with his small force of around 1,000 men. This choice, though militarily modest, spoke volumes about his character. In fulfilling his crusading vow, Edward enhanced his reputation as a devout and chivalric leader, an image that would serve him well in England's internal and external affairs. After wintering in Sicily and recruiting additional support, Edward set sail for Acre, the capital of the fading kingdom of Jerusalem. He arrived in May 1271. What he found there was grim. The once great Crusader territories had withered to a narrow coastal corridor. Jerusalem, Antioch, and countless other fortresses had fallen to the Mamluks, whose sultan, Baybars, had been waging a relentless campaign of attrition since the mid-1260s. Even the coastal cities of Acre, Tyre, and Sidon were under constant threat. Muslim fleets blockaded harbors. Mamluk raids disrupted trade and devastated outlying settlements. Despite being the largest Western force to reach the Holy Land in years, Edward knew his numbers were insufficient to launch a full-scale counteroffensive. His campaign would ultimately be limited in scope, but its timing, symbolism, and leadership marked the final flicker of European crusading ambition in the region. The Ninth Crusade closed an era. With its end, the notion of large-scale crusades led by monarchs faded. The Holy Land would never again see such coordinated Western military efforts. What had begun with the thunderous zeal of Urban II and the mass mobilization of knights and kings now gave way to smaller, more fragmented engagements. The dream of Christian Jerusalem remained, but the age of crusading empires was drawing to a quiet, fractured close. By the early 1270s, the Crusader states were shadows of their former strength. Years of war, territorial losses, and population decline had left them unable to mount significant military campaigns. The Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights still maintained effective fighting forces, but they focused on guarding their castles, unwilling to risk everything in open-field battles that could end in disaster. Into this fragile situation stepped Prince Edward of England, the future King Edward I. Unlike the grand visions of earlier crusaders, Edward embraced a more measured strategy. He understood that the age of sweeping conquest was over. In place of holy war thunder, he adopted a quieter plan: focused raids, strategic diplomacy, and defensive fortification. In the summer of 1271, he led targeted strikes near Acre and Nazareth. These operations met with some success on the battlefield, but failed to secure permanent gains. At the same time, Edward reached out to the Mongol Ilkhanate under Abaka Khan. The Mongols, who ruled Persia and parts of Mesopotamia, were historic enemies of the Mamluks. There was hope that a joint campaign could strike a devastating blow. Meanwhile, Edward strengthened Crusader defenses, especially around Acre, knowing that any future success would depend on securing what little ground remained. A glimmer of opportunity appeared in November 1271. A small Mongol force entered northern Syria. Edward seized the moment, launching a raid toward Kakun to divert Mamluk forces. But the plan fell apart. Baybars, the Mamluk Sultan, moved swiftly and crushed the Mongol force before it could coordinate with Edward. The chance for an allied breakthrough vanished. After this setback, Edward turned fully to diplomacy. In May 1272, he negotiated a 10-year, 10-month, and 10-day truce with Baybars. It did not reverse Crusader losses or regain territory, but it did buy time. The agreement safeguarded the remaining Christian enclaves along the coast and stabilized the region, for now. Then came one of the most dramatic moments of Edward's crusade. On June 17, 1272, an assassin, an Ismaili agent who had infiltrated his household, struck with a poisoned dagger. Edward killed the attacker but suffered a deep wound. Though he survived, the event quickly became legendary. Some chroniclers blamed Baybars, while others saw it as an isolated act or even an exaggerated tale crafted to glorify Edward. One especially romantic detail captured imaginations across Europe: that Edward's wife, Eleanor of Castile, heroically sucked the poison from his wound to save him. Medically implausible, perhaps, but undeniably powerful in chivalric lore. As he recovered, Edward received news that changed everything. His father, King Henry III, had died in November 1272. Edward was now king. Duty called him home. On September 24th, he departed Acre, quietly ending what would be the final major Crusader expedition. Militarily, Edward's crusade achieved little. No fortresses were retaken, no major cities fell. The strategic map remained unchanged, yet it was not without impact. His presence in the Holy Land boosted morale. His diplomacy bought a precious decade of peace. And in many ways, Edward's careful, calculated campaign marked the end of an era. The dream of Christendom reclaiming the Holy Land by force was fading. The Crusader spirit lingered, but its golden age had passed into history. The Ninth Crusade may not have changed the course of war, but it did change the course of diplomacy. Under Prince Edward of England, soon to be Edward I, European engagement with the Middle East began to shift. Edward reached out to the Mongol Ilkhanate, seeking an alliance against the common Muslim enemy. It was an early glimpse of what would become a defining feature of later European strategy in the region: diplomatic outreach, not just military confrontation. The truce he negotiated with Sultan Baybars also foreshadowed a growing European realization. Some goals could be achieved more effectively through negotiation than through endless crusading campaigns. For Baybars and the Mamluk Sultanate, Edward's crusade was little more than an irritant. The Mongol threat to the east remained far more urgent. Baybars, by then a seasoned leader, had already rolled back many of the Crusader territories. When he died in 12, he left behind a militarized and centralized state ready to finish the job. Edward returned to England in 1272 to begin a long and transformative reign. Though he would never return to the Holy Land, his experiences during the Crusade left a mark. In campaigns across Wales and Scotland, Edward applied what he had learned: logistics, siege warfare, and military discipline. He remained invested in crusading causes, but was increasingly pulled by the demands of governance. Meanwhile, the Crusader states drifted toward their end. Though the truce with Baybars bought them time, the rot had already set in. Dependent on Italian trade guilds and the presence of military orders, these enclaves became little more than commercial outposts. There was no vision of independent sovereignty, only survival. Discussions of new crusades flared occasionally in Europe, but no monarch mustered the will or resources to act. The final blow came under Sultan Qalawun and his son Al-Ashraf Khalil. In 1289, Tripoli fell. In 1291, the last true bastion, Acre, was besieged by an overwhelming Mamluk force. The city fell on May 18, 1291, after desperate resistance. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Tortosa all surrendered or were abandoned soon after. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land, nearly 200 years old, was over. The Ninth Crusade marked the end of the grand-numbered Crusades. Though smaller expeditions and crusading rhetoric would persist in other theaters, Spain, the Baltic, even within Europe, it was clear the age of the Great Eastern Crusades had passed. Edward's campaign, limited and pragmatic, had pointed to this transition. From religion to realpolitik, from zeal to commerce, from conquest to diplomacy. Europe itself was changing. Centralized monarchies were emerging. Royal focus shifted toward domestic consolidation. Commercial networks began to span continents. And with them, new priorities, stability, trade, and influence, replaced the old dreams of a Christian Jerusalem. The crusading orders, stripped of their purpose, adapted. Some morphed into banking houses, others took root in new political landscapes, or were absorbed into national militaries. The crusading ideal didn't vanish, it evolved. From battlefield to boardroom, from holy war to high diplomacy. The story of the Crusades ended not with a clash of swords, but with the redefinition of what power and salvation meant in a changing world. The idea of crusading, of holy war and armed pilgrimage, did not die with the fall of Acre. It evolved. The same impulse that once drew thousands to the Holy Land found new expressions across Europe. In the Spanish Reconquista, in the Baltic campaigns against pagan tribes, in wars against heretics, and later in the ideological justifications for European colonial expansion. The crusading spirit survived, even as the Crusades themselves came to an end. In the Islamic world, the final victories over Crusader enclaves carried deep symbolic weight. Yet in military terms, the changes were modest. By the time of their fall, Latin Christian holdings had dwindled to a few coastal ports, rich in trade but weak in defense. The Mamluk Sultanate faced larger challenges, particularly the Mongols advancing from the east. And so, even as crusading faded, Christian-Muslim interaction continued. Pilgrimages to Jerusalem did not cease. The Franciscans were granted custodianship over key Christian sites. Trade between Europe and the Mamluks flourished. Diplomacy became more sophisticated. European courts began sending permanent envoys to Muslim capitals. A new era of contact was dawning. The Ottoman Empire would rise in the 14th and 15th centuries, reshaping the region once again. But the frameworks of exchange, religious, commercial, diplomatic, had already been laid in the crucible of the Crusades. In this light, the Ninth Crusade was not a final act, but a hinge in history. Edward's small expedition marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. His military gains were minimal, but his diplomatic initiatives hinted at the future, a future where dialogue, trade, and negotiation would increasingly replace conquest and crusade. And so, after nearly 2 centuries, the Crusades closed their chapter. But their echoes remain, in the names of cities, in the scars on stone walls, in the cultural memories of East and West. The age of the Crusades shaped our world, in ways both glorious and terrible. If you've made it this far, thank you. You've just traveled across 200 years of war, faith, ambition, betrayal, and endurance. And if this journey through history has resonated with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Nocturne Historia for more deep, cinematic explorations of our shared past. Like the video to support long-form history content. Share your thoughts below. What part of the Crusades surprised you the most? And most importantly, turn on notifications, because the next story begins where this one ends. This was not just the story of the Crusades. It was the story of how ideas can change the world, and sometimes, how they refuse to die. If this journey through centuries of faith, ambition, and conflict moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of the Crusades challenged your perspective the most? For more stories that explore the forgotten paths of history, faith, and power, don't forget to subscribe to Nocturne Historia and share this episode with someone who loves history as much as you do. And if you're still listening, perhaps you're one of us, the ones who find peace in reflection, even amid the echoes of war. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, sleep well and let history whisper you to rest.